Welcome to Neighbors Recounted, the place where ordinary people share the moments that shattered their sense of safety forever. These aren't campfire legends or internet myths. These are the stories people hesitate to tell, because once you hear them, you don't unhear them. As you listen tonight, pay attention to what unsettles you, and tell us in the comments what you would have done instead. If you've lived through something that still follows you in silence, this is where your story belongs. Subscribe and settle in. Some roads never really let you leave. The night I realized something could stand up on two legs in my headlights, I understood how thin the wall is between curiosity and terror. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 36 that September, living out of a worn but faithful Volkswagen Westphalia, the kind with faded blue paint and a pop-top roof that always smelled faintly of dust and old pine needles. I'd spent most of that year drifting through the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee, chasing isolation the way some people chase peace. By the time I climbed toward Hintuga Overlook, the high ridge that curls along the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains, the world already felt like it was folding in on itself. Campgrounds were quieter than they'd ever been. Conversations felt cautious. Every stranger felt like a risk. Hintuga was supposed to be a quick stop. One night, maybe two. A place to park high above the valleys, watch fog lift at dawn, drink coffee while the trees whispered below. That was the plan. It always is. The road up to the overlook narrowed into a ribbon of gravel that twisted through dense forest, the kind where the canopy presses so thick overhead that daylight turns watery and dim. With every mile higher, the air cooled sharply. My Westphalia struggled on the grades, engine humming with that familiar tired loyalty, like an old dog pulling itself up one more hill because it trusts you. The smell inside shifted from dust and gasoline to cold sap and wet leaves seeping in through cracked window seals. By the time I reached the pull-off, daylight was already thinning. The sky was bruised purple and gray, clouds dragging low enough that it felt like I could reach up and smear them with my palm. There were no other RVs, no cars, no laughter, just forest, endless forest. That should have been my first warning. I parked with the nose of the VW facing outward, habit drilled into me of solo camping. Always leave yourself an escape. I stepped out into air so cold it pricked my lungs. The overlook itself was muted by fog rolling in heavy, swallowing the view in shifting white curtains. Somewhere far below, wind moved through the valleys like a slow, distant tide. I told myself I liked the quiet. That was my lie. The truth was quieter. I didn't know how to live without movement anymore. I cooked a simple meal, beans warmed on a small burner, bread torn by hand. No music, no phone signal, just the hiss of the stove and the occasional crack of distant branches. The darkness crept in the way it always does in the Smokies. Not suddenly, but with a steady, patient encroachment. 1 minute I could still make out tree lines. The next, they were just black layers against deeper black. At first, the unease was mild, the familiar kind that always comes when the sun drops and the mind starts grazing in the empty spaces. I locked the doors out of routine more than fear and climbed into the back of the van with a book I didn't read. The temperature kept falling. Cold seeped through the metal floor. I wrapped in a blanket that still carried the faint smell of campfire smoke from weeks before. Then came the sound. It was faint, so faint at first that I thought it was wind slipping through hollow branches. A single sharp knock somewhere out beyond the fog. Not a crash, not a snap, a knock, hollow, deliberate. I froze with the book open in my hands. The sound came again, farther to the left this time. Then again, a few seconds later, closer. My skin tightened in small electric waves. Wood knocks aren't uncommon in forests, branches falling, trees shifting. That's what I told myself. That's what every rational part of me insisted. But there was an arrangement to it, a spacing between the sounds that tugged at the back of my thoughts like fingers brushing the inside of my skull. I waited. Minutes passed. Long enough that my breathing slowed again. Long enough for fear to feel silly. Then something ran along the side of the van. Not brushed, not bumped. Ran. The entire length of the vehicle tremored with the vibration of quick impacts, thud, 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 like hands or claws striking every panel from front to back in one continuous glide. The sound was so close, so intimate that my muscles locked hard enough to ache. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I didn't even reach for the keys. Silence followed. Thick, dense, pressurized. I told myself it was a bear. That's what you're supposed to say in the Smokies. Bear fits everything. Bear explains everything. Bear lets you sleep again. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, I forced myself to move. Slow. Every motion careful as if the air itself might snap if I disturbed it. I slid into the driver's seat, keys already cold in my palm. When I turned the ignition, the engine coughed once, loud in the silence, then settled into a low idle. The headlights cut forward into a wall of fog so thick it swallowed distance entirely, and that's when I saw something straighten up inside the beams. At first, it looked like a shadow caught mid-unfold, a hunched mass near the tree line that seemed to lengthen upward as the light burned through the mist. Then I saw the legs, not 4, 2, long, thin, bent backward at the joints as they lifted the weight of a body that should not have been able to balance that way. The upper half rose slowly, wrong in its posture, too upright, too deliberate. The fog clung to it, writhing around the outline like it didn't want to show what it was outlining. My breath left me in a broken sound. The face never came into full clarity. The headlights slid across it as if it refused to take shape, but I saw enough to know it wasn't animal in any way I understood. The eyes reflected wrong, too high, too wide apart, and the mouth, when it opened, stretched downward instead of across. It watched me, not curiously, calculating. My hands shook so hard I slammed the gear into drive instead of easing it. Gravel sprayed as the tires spun. The figure didn't lunge. It didn't flinch. It simply stepped back into the fog with one smooth motion, as if it had already decided something about me that I didn't want to know the answer to. I drove blind down that mountain road, heart battering against my ribs hard enough to bruise itself. The fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet of light. Trees rushed past in black streaks. Somewhere behind me, I felt watched, not with eyes, but with attention, heavy and sustained. The road finally dipped into lower elevation, where the mist thinned into ragged shreds. I didn't stop until I reached the first wide pull-off, well past the ranger station. Even then, I left the engine running for a full minute before shutting it down, afraid the silence might invite something back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright in the driver's seat until dawn bled pale through the windshield. When the mountains finally reappeared in gray detail, they looked innocent again, ancient, passive, as if nothing in them had ever learned how to stand like a man. By midday, I told myself a simpler story. Fog illusion. Exhausted nerves. A trick of light and panic, compressing reality into something grotesque. The human mind does that, I told myself. It makes monsters out of shadows when it's pushed too far from comfort. That lie lasted exactly 2 days. Because 2 nights later, parked beside a creek 30 miles away, something knocked on the side of my Volkswagen again with the same hollow rhythm. And this time it used 3 fingers. The knocks came in threes, not fast, not slow, just measured enough to feel intentional. I sat frozen in the driver's seat with the creek whispering just beyond the trees and the sound tapping through metal straight into my bones. 1, 2, 3. Then a pause long enough for hope to try to crawl back in. Then again. I didn't turn on the lights this time. I didn't start the engine. I didn't even think. My body refused motion, as if moving might confirm that I was truly being tested instead of haunted by coincidence. The smell came next. A wet, coppery rot drifted through the cracked window vents. Not like decay from animals. Not like stagnant water. It felt breathed. Warm underneath, cold on the surface, the way iron smells when rain hits it after a drought. It filled the van slowly, deliberately, as if whatever stood outside understood exactly how sealed my space really was. The knocks stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed against my ears until I thought they might ring. The creek kept flowing, indifferent, and that somehow terrified me more than if everything had gone quiet. Normal sounds continuing meant nature didn't see a problem. It meant whatever stood outside wasn't breaking any rules it recognized. That's when the scratching began. Not frantic. Methodical. Slow lines dragging across the panel just behind the driver's door. Each pass ended with a faint lift, then resumed slightly higher. Measuring. Mapping. Learning where I was soft. "Go away," I whispered, and hated myself for the thinness of my own voice. The scratching climbed. Metal sang under pressure. The sound moved up toward the window, then stopped. I felt it then. The weight. Not physical. Perceptual, like standing too close to an animal and knowing without seeing that it's looking back at you. My breath fogged the glass from the inside. Another breath appeared on the outside. Not centered. Higher. I forced my head to turn by pure will, vertebrae protesting the movement. The fogged glass in the small side window blurred everything beyond it into pale distortion. Then a long, thin shadow slid into place behind the condensation. Fingers, or something shaped like them, pressed once against the window. The glass bowed inward slightly. I don't remember reaching for the key. I don't remember shifting into drive. What I remember is the explosion of sound as the engine roared to life and the scratching turned into a sudden, violent slam against the side of the van, hard enough to rock me sideways. The tires screamed against damp dirt as I burst out of that clearing, branches whipping against the Westphalia like grasping hands. In the rearview mirror, I saw it run, not on 2 legs, on 4, but not like any animal I've ever seen. Its limbs bent in too many directions as it flowed after me through the trees for just a few seconds before the darkness swallowed it. It moved like bone had learned a different grammar, like the idea of a joint had been redesigned by something that didn't need one. I didn't stop driving until my vision tunneled and the white lines blurred together. When I finally pulled over near a closed roadside picnic area, my hands were spasming so badly I had to cradle them between my knees to make them still. That was the night I stopped telling myself it was coincidence. Sleep never really came again after that, not fully. Even when exhaustion knocked me unconscious, my mind stayed perched on a wire-thin edge of awareness, ready to snap awake at the smallest sound. Every campground after that felt staged, artificial, as if I were being allowed to feel safe on borrowed time. It didn't follow me every night. That was somehow worse. Sometimes days would pass without incident. During the daylight, I convinced myself again that isolation can trick perception, that fear can echo forward into empty space. I talked to myself while driving just to hear a human voice. I lingered near other campers longer than felt natural. I started avoiding overlooks and high ridges and fog-heavy valleys without consciously admitting why. But when the temperature dipped suddenly at night, when the air turned sharp and still, I felt it again every time. That sense of attention, that sense of being a decision that something patient was waiting to finish making. The third encounter happened near a fire tower trailhead with a single gravel lot tucked deep between ridgelines. I shouldn't have stayed there. My instincts had already learned the pattern even if my mind hadn't fully accepted it yet. High elevation, low visibility, isolation, thick enough to feel intentional. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour after sunset. I was cooking soup with numb fingers when the sound of footsteps began circling the van. Not stomping, not sneaking, just walking, evenly paced. 1 footfall every second, crunching softly through leaves and grit. I tracked it by sound alone as it made a full loop. When it reached the front again, it stopped directly in line with my head. Then it knocked. Once slow, hard. I didn't answer. I stared straight ahead, heart ticking off the seconds in frantic bursts. A second knock followed, then a third. After that came the voice. It wasn't loud. It didn't demand. It didn't threaten. It copied. At first, it just breathed. The same rhythm as me. Then it whispered a word I had spoken earlier on the phone while pretending to leave a casual message for a friend. My own voice played back with a delay just slow enough to feel unclean. "Yeah, I'm good. Staying another night." The tone was perfect. The cadence was mine. But the spaces between syllables were wrong. Stretched. like the speaker had to remember where emptiness belonged. My stomach caved inward. I didn't realize I was crying until tears splattered onto my lap. I covered my mouth with both hands to stop the sound. Outside, whatever held my voice tried it again, this time softer, closer to the window. I'm good. The words slid wrong. Bent in the middle. Something brushed the glass above my head. Not a strike. A caress. I broke then. I slammed the ignition and floored it without thinking, gravel spraying wildly as the van lurched backward before catching forward. The voice outside warped into something wet and furious as my headlights swept across the clearing. It stood in full view this time, tall enough that its head brushed low branches. Skin pale and dark at once, like moonlight stretched over mud. Its mouth hung open far too long, unhinged downward into a throat that pulsed as it tried to force my stolen words through a body that didn't understand how they were supposed to sound. Its eyes didn't reflect, they absorbed. I drove straight at it. At the last possible moment, it dropped, not forward, not sideways, but straight down, folding into the ground as if the earth itself had opened to receive it. The tires rolled over empty space. I didn't look back. By dawn, I was shaking with feverish cold despite the heater running full blast. I pulled over near a serviced campground with actual restrooms, actual people, families, dogs, folding chairs. The sight of them made my chest ache with a longing so violent it felt like grief. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I told myself again that fear wants witnesses and I would starve it of that satisfaction. But something had changed. It was done playing with distance. That afternoon, while dumping water at a utility spigot, I noticed marks along the lower side panel of the van that hadn't been there before. 3 shallow gouges, parallel, evenly spaced, too clean for branches, too narrow for bear claws. That night, parked between 2 other RVs with porch lights glowing warm on either side, I still woke at 2:17 a.m. to the sound of breathing that did not belong to any human nearby. It came from beneath the van. Slow, patient, waiting for me to decide whether I still believed metal and walls and proximity could protect me from a thing that had learned how to stand when it needed to, crawl when it chose, and speak when it wanted something opened. The breathing beneath the van didn't stop until sunrise. It never rushed, never scraped. It just remained, slow, damp, impossibly close, until the birds began to call and early campers stirred with coffee cups and stiff joints. Only then did the weight of its attention lift, like something deciding it had learned enough for the night. I left that campground without dumping, without breakfast, without looking at anyone long enough to let them see the state of my eyes. By then, I understood the pattern I'd been too afraid to name. High places first, isolation, fog. But now it was bold enough to follow me into populated light, bold enough to wait beneath the thin disguise of normal life. It didn't need wilderness anymore. It just preferred it. The next 2 days passed without incident, which should have comforted me. Instead, it hollowed me out. Silence had become suspicious. Peace felt staged. Every absence felt like preparation. I kept driving east, back toward the Smokies, without admitting I was doing it. Roads curved the way they always had, but now every bend felt guided. Signs repeated. Turnoffs reappeared like déjà vu. When I finally saw the brown marker for Heintuga again, my chest tightened so hard I nearly blacked out. I didn't turn. The road curved anyway. Higher. Colder. Fog already crawling upslope, though it was barely mid-afternoon. I pulled over once, slapped myself in the face hard enough to see stars, and told my reflection in the rearview mirror that I was still making choices. My voice came out thin and convinced no one. By the time the overlook appeared through the white veil, twilight had returned like an old debt. Same pull-off, same black trees stacked in endless ranks, same hush pressing in from all sides. I sat there with the engine running, hands locked on the wheel, waiting for the fear to crest into motion. Nothing happened, so I turned off the engine. The silence bloomed instantly, thick, absolute. Fog slid over the headlights in slow coils. I stepped out of the van with my legs trembling so badly I had to brace against the door. The cold cut straight through my jacket, sharper than the first night, as if the mountain itself had leaned closer. I'm here. I said softly, not sure who I meant it for. Whatever you wanted, I'm here. The words felt insane the moment they left my mouth, but the waiting had become worse than the chase. I couldn't live inside that kind of anticipation anymore. At first, nothing answered. Then the fog shifted, not with wind, with intent. It peeled back from the tree line in a slow, widening arc, clearing a narrow corridor straight ahead of me. The woods beyond stood revealed in layers, trunks like pillars, branches knotted into black lace against a dimming sky, and something stepped forward out of the depth. It stood fully upright now. There was no confusion left in its shape, no pretense of animal motion. The legs were too long, the hips sat wrong. The arms hung almost to its knees, ending in hands that carried too many joints to count cleanly. Its skin, or what passed for it, looked thin as damp parchment pulled tight over motion underneath, mottled with shadow where no shadow should settle. Its face, I struggle even now to frame it in memory without my thoughts sliding away. The eyes were placed like a person's, but everything else had collapsed downward. Nose flattened, mouth drawn into that same vertical cleft I'd seen in the headlights. When it breathed, the opening fluttered from throat to sternum. It took one step closer. The fog recoiled from it like breath from fire. I backed into the van without looking, palms scraping metal, never lifting my eyes from its impossible posture. Fear made strange room inside me then, something like clarity, thin and piercing. "You don't get to follow me anymore," I said. The thing tilted its head, then it spoke with my voice again, perfect this time. "You came back." The words hit me like betrayal, not from it, from myself. "You don't get to wear me," I said, shaking now in full-body tremors I no longer tried to hide. "You want something. Say it with your own mouth." The vertical mouth stretched wider. Sound poured out that wasn't language at all, layers of tone stacked inside one another like throats within throats, vibrating the fog and the bones of the car beside me. The air thrummed, my teeth rang, and inside the noise, buried deep and faint, I recognized something horrible. Imitation isn't theft. It's learning. Images broke loose in my mind, not memories, not visions, but impressions so sharp they felt borrowed. High ridges at different times. Other vehicles. Other people who had stood where I was standing now, curious or lonely or seeking quiet from a loud world. Some had driven away shakily. Some had not. It didn't hunt bodies. It learned through proximity. It learned how to stand, how to run, how to knock, how to speak, how to pass. The realization crushed the breath out of me. "You need us," I whispered, "to become us." The creature leaned closer. Its eyes reflected the faint light of my dash for the first time. "Yes," it said with my father's voice. Something inside me finally burned through the paralysis. Not bravery. Something older and meaner. The refusal to be edited while still breathing. I wrenched open the door, dove inside, and slammed it shut hard enough to rattle the glass. The engine turned over on the first try as if the van itself had decided it was done waiting. Headlights blasted through the fog and cut the creature in half with white. It raised its arms, not to block the light, but to welcome it. I drove, straight at it. This time, it didn't drop away. The impact was like hitting a wall of wet timber. The van bucked violently. I tasted blood as my forehead snapped forward. The hood crumpled with a shriek of tortured metal, and then the pressure vanished. The headlights shone forward into nothing but broken fog and retreating trees. I didn't stop. The road tore downward beneath me, curves blurring, gravity dragging speed out of fear. I didn't slow until the elevation shifted, until the fog thinned into scraps, until the night widened again into breathable darkness. When I finally pulled over miles later, the van steamed softly in the cold. The windshield was spider-webbed but intact. The hood was folded in on itself like an injured animal. There were no claw marks, no blood, no sign of what I had struck. Dawn found me parked in a rest area with truckers idling through coffee and diesel haze. I slept for 2 solid hours without dreams and woke up surprised to still be myself. I never went back to Heintuga. I sold the Westphalia 3 months later without explaining the damage in anything but practical terms. Frame strain, wildlife collision, old metal. The truth never fits into insurance boxes anyway. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake at exactly 2:17 a.m. My room is quiet. My door is locked. The world looks ordinary. And I listen, not for knocking, not for scratching, for breathing that doesn't belong to anything I can see. Because the worst thing I learned on that mountain isn't that something can stand up on two legs when it wants to. It's that sometimes it doesn't need to anymore, and that knowledge follows you long after the road finally lets you go. The first time I heard the singing, I thought it was coming from inside my own head. That's how it began. Quiet, fragile, almost tender. Not loud enough to be real, not distant enough to ignore, just enough to make me doubt myself. My name is Ethan. I was 33 in April of 2021, and I had driven my old Volkswagen camper, cream-colored, dented on the rear left panel, engine coughing like a lifelong smoker, into Greenbrier Campground with my younger sister, Lila. She was 29 then. We'd grown up in West Virginia, but neither of us had been back to this stretch of the mountains since we were kids, since before our father disappeared into those same woods one winter and never came out. We told each other this trip had nothing to do with that. We told each other we were just tired of cities that never slept, tired of sirens, tired of news alerts, tired of feeling like the ground under our lives never stayed solid. We wanted trees. We wanted quiet. We wanted something that felt older than us, something that didn't care who we were or what we'd lost. Greenbrier was supposed to be that place. All day, the campground felt wrong in subtle ways. Not dangerous, just off. The air was too still for spring, no bird song, no insects. Even the wind moved through the leaves like it was trying not to be noticed. The ranger at the gate barely looked up when we checked in, just slid the map toward us with two fingers and said, "You'll want Site 14, furthest one with power." He didn't smile. He didn't explain. We told ourselves that was just how some people are. By the time we parked, the sun was already sinking behind the ridgeline. The forest folded inward around our site, tall black trunks cutting the sky into thin blue slivers. The smell hit me first. Wet soil, old leaves, something faintly sour underneath it all, like standing water that had been trapped too long. Lila wrinkled her nose and laughed it off. "Smells like childhood," she said, but I didn't remember childhood smelling quite like rot. We set up fast, too fast. Neither of us said it, but we were both rushing the dark. The woods around us absorbed light instead of reflecting it. The Volkswagen's headlights didn't push far into the trees. They just stopped like they'd hit an invisible wall. When I turned them off, the darkness rushed back in as if it had been waiting. That night we ate canned soup on the little fold-out table. No fire. The air was damp, and the idea of smoke clinging to us felt wrong, like we'd be marking ourselves. I couldn't explain that thought. It just arrived fully formed and sat heavy in my chest. We talked about safe things, work, road stories, the absurd way this ancient van still refused to die. We didn't talk about Dad. We never did. The singing started at 11:17 p.m. I know the exact time because I checked my phone the moment my brain stopped pretending it was hallucinating. It was a woman's voice. Soft, slow. No words I recognized, just a melody that rose and fell like someone humming through grief. It drifted through the trees with no clear direction. Not left, not right, not near, not far. It was as if the woods themselves were singing. Lila froze mid-sip. "You hear that too?" she whispered. I nodded, too afraid that if I spoke aloud it would get closer. For several minutes we just listened. The song didn't repeat. It didn't stop either. It wandered. Bent notes in strange places. Lila finally whispered, "Maybe it's another camper." But even as she said it, her eyes told me she didn't believe it. There were no other lights anywhere near our site. No laughter, no footsteps, no engines, just us, and that voice threading through the dark. I told myself it was someone lost on a trail, or someone drunk, or someone playing a trick. Every rational explanation lined up in my mind like soldiers, but none of them fired. None of them landed. Around midnight, the singing stopped. Not faded. Stopped, like a switch being cut. The The sudden silence was worse. My ears rang with it. The woods leaned in. Lila let out a breath she had been holding too long. See? Just someone messing around. But she locked the van doors right after she said it. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay on the thin mattress listening to the forest rediscover its normal sounds, branches creaking, something small moving through leaves, the steady pulse of distant water. I told myself the night had found its rhythm again. Then came the smell. It crept inside around 2 a.m., a thick, coppery scent, warm and wrong, like rust soaked in rainwater. My stomach turned before my brain caught up. It wasn't like blood exactly, but it lived in the same family of smells, metallic, alive. "Do you smell that?" Lila whispered in the dark. I didn't answer. I was already sitting up. The odor hung thick near the floor, pooling low like fog. It made my eyes sting. My heart began to hammer with the slow realization that whatever it was outside first, and now it was inside with us. We cracked a window just an inch. The smell didn't leave. It deepened. Somewhere beyond the glass, a branch snapped. Slow, deliberate. Lila reached for my arm without looking at me. Her hand was ice. I realized then that I was shaking hard enough for the van to gently rock. And then, singing again. Closer this time. Right outside. The voice was no longer weaving through the forest. It was stationary. Fixed. It hovered just beyond the door in a way that made distance meaningless. I could hear breath between the notes now. Wet. Labored. The melody was the same as before, but corrupted, like a familiar lullaby sung through broken teeth. Every instinct in me screamed not to move, not to look, not to acknowledge. Lila leaned in and whispered so quietly it barely existed. "Ethan, it stopped walking when we stopped moving." That truth shattered something in me. The song drifted for nearly a minute. Then it changed direction, not deeper into the woods, but along the length of the Volkswagen. I heard the slow slide of feet in wet leaves. I heard fingers brush metal. Tap, tap, tap. Each touch landed gently, exploratory, like it was learning the shape of us through the skin of the van. Lila started crying without sound. My mind betrayed me then. It pulled our father into the moment without my permission. The way he'd hummed when he was nervous, the way he'd gone quiet in the weeks before he vanished, the way the forest had swallowed his voice too. The tapping stopped at the door. The handle didn't move. The singing didn't stop. It just waited. Minutes stretched into something shapeless. The air inside felt too small to breathe. My thoughts kept circling one question I couldn't outrun. Why hadn't it tried to get in? And then the question answered itself, because it wanted us to come out. The singing cut off mid-note. Silence poured back in, thick and absolute. I don't know which of us moved first. I only know that suddenly both of our hands were on the lock, fingers overlapping, trembling so violently we struggled with the simple turn. The moment the door cracked open, the forest rushed forward, not in sound but in pressure. Cold air flooded inside along with that rotten metal scent. And the woods were empty. No figure, no movement, no footprints near the door, nothing where the voice had been. Lila staggered down the steps and turned slowly in a full circle, scanning the dark with wild, unfocused eyes. "That's not possible," she kept whispering. "That's not possible." The singing started again, far away now, deep in the trees. And as we both turned toward it, I realized with sickening clarity that it hadn't followed us out. It had moved ahead of us, and it was waiting. The sound moved through the trees the way fog moves through valleys, slow, patient, impossible to pin down. No matter how hard I strained my ears, I couldn't locate it. It wasn't right. It wasn't left. It was everywhere. That wasn't us. Lila whispered, "It's leading us." I wanted to deny it. I needed to deny it. My brain scrambled for the comfort of reason. Sound bouncing through hollow trunks, echoes folding over uneven terrain, auditory tricks of the dark. But none of that mattered to my body. My body already knew we were being drawn. "We go back inside," I said, forcing the words through a throat that felt lined with thorns. We lock the door. We wait for morning. The singing dipped low, almost approving. Lila's face twisted in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids, standing at the edge of those same woods, waiting for our father to come back out. "You said that last time," she whispered. You said we'd wait, and he never came back. The air between us broke. Before I could stop her, she took one step forward, toward the sound. My hand closed around her wrist hard enough to hurt. Don't, I said. That's not Dad out there. Whatever that is, it knows how to sound like what you want. Her eyes flicked to mine, wide and glassy. It's not making his voice, she said. It's making mine. The realization slid through me cold. I listened again. Not to the melody, but to the shape of it, to the way it bent at the ends of notes, the way breath gathered before certain rises. I had heard that cadence my whole life, in the hallway outside my bedroom when we were children, in late-night phone calls when she cried and tried not to. The forest was wearing my sister's voice. Lila screamed then, short, sharp, torn straight from the chest. The sound cracked the woods open. The singing stopped instantly. For one awful second, nothing replaced it. Then the forest answered. From all around us came the slow return of movement. Leaves dragging, branches bending, heavy shapes shifting weight where seconds ago there had been stillness. The woods were waking up. Inside, I said. This time I didn't ask. We ran. The van door slammed behind us with a sound too loud for such a quiet world. I threw the deadbolt and leaned against it with my back, chest heaving, half expecting the metal to cave in beneath pressure that never came. Instead, there was only a knock. Not hard, not threatening, polite. 3 soft taps. Tap, tap, tap. Don't answer it, Lila breathed. The knocking moved to the side panel. Tap, tap, tap. Then the back doors. Tap, tap, tap. The cadence was wrong, too careful, like it was practicing manners it didn't understand. You don't have to be afraid, came Lila's voice from the driver's side window. Not her voice as she spoke, her voice as she cried, as she begged, as she cracked. The glass vibrated with the hum of it. I clamped my hands over my ears, but the sound didn't lessen. It wasn't traveling through air anymore. It was inside my head, using memory as a doorway. You left me here, it said in her tone. You promised you wouldn't. My knees buckled under me against the door. Lila backed away slowly, shaking so hard she could barely stand. Make it stop, she whispered to me like I could command the woods. Please make it stop. The knock returned, harder now. Tap, tap, tap. A second set joined it out of time. Tap, tap. Something scraped along the roof. The Volkswagen rocked gently, like a cradle. The smell surged back in waves, metallic, humid, alive. It clung to the back of my throat, thick enough to taste. My eyes watered. I felt nausea rise and stay, hovering just below escape, and beneath it all, beneath every horror stacking on the next, something else crept in with quiet precision. Cold. The temperature inside the van dropped so fast my breath fogged in front of my face. Condensation raced across the windows from the edges inward, like frost being drawn by invisible fingers. The cold wasn't empty. It pressed against skin with weight, with intention. Cold means death, Lila whispered distantly. Dad used to say that. He said cold is how the forest tells you it's done with you. The driver's side window bowed inward, not from a blow, from pressure, like a face leaning into it from the outside. The glass stretched just enough to give the illusion of shape, a vague suggestion of a brow, a mouth where breath smeared warm condensation into clear arcs. I found him, the thing using Lila's voice murmured. He's tired. He wants you to come see. The words unstitched every logical restraint I had left. Rage surged up through fear so fast it shocked me. I lunged forward and slammed my palm against the glass. Get out of her voice, I screamed. You don't get to wear her. You don't get to use him. The pressure against the window vanished instantly. The cold retreated. The forest went quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Then behind us, the back doors unlocked. The click was soft, mechanical, final. Lila and I turned as one. The handle turned slowly by itself. Metal whispered against metal. The doors eased open. The darkness beyond them wasn't empty. It curved inward unnaturally, like the inside of a throat. The smell rolled in thick and undeniable now. Old water, iron, soil turned too many times. The singing returned. Not from one voice, from many. Layered, braided, familiar. Each note carried a fragment of someone we loved. Our mother's tired murmurs, our uncle's laughter, A long-dead neighbor who used to teach us how to skip stones, all of them woven into one impossible choir. My body wanted to step toward it, not from curiosity, from grief, from longing so sharp it cut deeper than terror ever could. Lila took one involuntary step forward. I tackled her to the floor before she could take another. The moment her body broke the threshold line between air and shadow, the singing surged eagerly, swelling with hunger. Shadows stretched inward from the open doors like reaching arms. "No," I screamed, dragging her back. My hands burned where the darkness brushed my skin, cold fire, numbing and alive. The back doors slammed shut with vicious force. The locks snapped back into place. Silence detonated through the van. For long seconds, absolute nothingness ruled. No knocking, no singing, no movement in the woods, just our broken breathing. Lila sobbed into the floor, soundless and shaking. I pressed my forehead to the metal wall and tried not to collapse myself into pieces beside her. My arms felt hollow, my legs felt like borrowed things. Minutes passed, then more. At some point, neither of us was sure if we were still alive or if the forest was simply letting us think we were. The engine coughed without warning. Once, twice. The dashboard lights flickered on. I hadn't touched the keys. The Volkswagen shuddered like something waking from a deep sleep. A low hum filled the cabin, the familiar, comforting purr of an ancient engine that should not have been able to start on its own. The headlights snapped on. Through the windshield, the dark trees leapt into sudden, blinding clarity. And standing directly in the beam, no more than 10 feet from the bumper, was my father. Or something that looked like him. He stood angled slightly wrong, joints stiff, posture mimicked from memory rather than lived. His jacket hung too neatly on his frame, untouched by dirt or weather or time. His eyes reflected the headlights with an animal's shine. He lifted his hand in a small, hesitant wave. The singing stopped completely. Lila made a sound I'd never heard from a human throat before. "Dad," she whispered. The thing smiled with his mouth, not with his eyes. It took one slow step forward. The engine revved higher. Behind us, deep in the forest, something answered with a low, thunderous groan, as if the land itself were clearing its throat. And in that moment, with my father's stolen face illuminated in harsh white light and the woods gathering breath behind him, I understood with absolute certainty that the forest was not trying to scare us. It was trying to claim us. The engine's whine climbed into a desperate pitch, shaking the steering wheel as if the Volkswagen itself were afraid of what stood before it. My hands moved without permission, slamming the gear into drive, foot crushing the gas so hard it felt like I meant to punch through the floor. The tires screamed against wet dirt. The thing wearing my father's face tilted its head, almost curious. Then the van lurched forward. We didn't hit him. We passed through where he stood like he was made of breath and shadow. The headlights swallowed his shape for a heartbeat, and then he was gone, scattered into dark as if he'd never been there at all. The forest erupted. Branches snapped so violently they sounded like gunfire. The ground pitched and rolled beneath us as if something immense were shifting its weight underground. Shadows peeled away from the trees and ran alongside us in broken, impossible angles. The singing returned in shredded fragments, torn into screams by our speed. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The narrow campground road twisted ahead of us, barely wide enough for the van. Trees leaned inward so tightly their branches scraped both sides of the vehicle at once, howling metal screams down the length of the body. The smell inside thickened until every breath felt like inhaling rusted water. Lila clutched the dashboard so hard her knuckles bled without either of us noticing. The headlights flickered. Once, twice. The darkness surged closer. "No, no, no," I gasped, slamming the steering wheel as if pain might keep the lights alive. Shapes burst from the tree line, too fast, too tall, too many legs. Antlers split the air above the beams. Eyes layered over eyes reflected back at us in sickening abundance. They didn't chase like animals, they followed like a tide. The temperature dropped again. Frost raced across the windshield from the corners inward. My breath became smoke. I felt the inside of my chest seize with cold so painful it felt sharpened. Then the road ended. Not at the gate, not at a clearing. It ended at a wall of trees that had not been there when we arrived. The forest had folded itself closed. I stood on the brakes. The van skidded sideways, slamming into the packed earth, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. The engine stalled with a wounded cough. Silence crashed down. The lights died. We sat in absolute dark. The cold pressed in immediately, heavy. It settled on my shoulders with the weight of something alive. I could feel the forest breathing now, could feel its attention. Lila whispered my name, just once. It wasn't her voice that answered. Ethan, my father's voice murmured gently from outside the driver's door. You were always the brave one. Something brushed the side mirror. A slow drag. You don't need to keep running, he said. You ran all your life. You ran from the mountains. You ran from me. You ran from her. The words struck where they were designed to land, not on my ears, but beneath my ribs. I had run, from grief, from memory, from the woods that ate men and wore their sons in sunlight years later. I stayed, his voice said. I learned the songs. I learned the paths. I learned what they wanted. The singing returned faintly beneath his words, swelling like a hidden undercurrent. It just wants you to remember, he whispered. The cold surged forward with his breath. Lila sobbed openly now, low and broken. And that's when I made the choice that still wakes me at night. Not to run, not to fight, but to refuse. I fumbled in the dark for the old emergency flare we kept under the seat. My fingers closed around cold plastic just as the door handle outside began to turn with that patient, polite slowness again. Ethan, Lila whispered brokenly, what are you? I struck the flare. Red fire roared into life inside the cabin with violent brilliance. Heat slammed outward in a tidal wave that made the shadows recoil like startled animals. Light shattered the darkness so completely it felt like breaking a spell mid-word. Outside, the voice cut off mid-syllable. The singing fractured into shrill chaos. The cold leapt backward as if burned. I threw the driver's door open and launched the flare into the forest as far as my shaking arm could hurl it. It spun end over end, painting the trees in blood-red light as it fell. The woods recoiled, not retreated, recoiled, like a living thing flinching from pain. The shapes dissolved backward into trunks and roots. The shadows fled into their rightful places. The singing shrank into a thin, wounded whimper and disappeared. The forest didn't go quiet. It went distant, like we had pushed it to the far end of a hallway. The temperature snapped back above freezing, so suddenly it made us both gasp. The smell thinned from rot to wet earth. Normal returned in broken, cautious pieces. The engine coughed, once, twice, then roared back to life like it had been waiting for permission. I didn't give the woods a second chance. I gunned the throttle and tore forward, straight through where the road had ended just moments before. And this time, the road was there. The gate came into view in a rush of gravel and breath and disbelief. The ranger's booth stood empty. No lights, no truck, no sign anyone had ever been there at all. We didn't stop until dawn, found us 2 hours down a mountain road at a gas station that smelled of asphalt and coffee and life. We sat in the van while the sun climbed slowly over ridgelines that now looked like ordinary mountains again. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Lila whispered, "It didn't want to kill us." I shook my head. No, it wanted us to stay. We learned later, through old records, through whispered local stories that never made the internet, that Greenbrier Campground had been closed 3 times over the last century. Always quietly, always after disappearances. Always reopened years later under new management, new signage, new lies. People vanished there every few decades, not in groups, in families, especially those with roots in the mountains, especially those who left and came back. We never returned, not to that campground, not to those woods, not to our father's grave marker with no body beneath it, but it didn't end there, because the forest doesn't need dirt under your feet to remember you. Sometimes, late at night, when cities fall quiet enough to resemble the shape of dark instead of light, I still hear it. Not clearly, not loudly, just enough to make me stop breathing for a second. A fragment of melody, a bending of notes that sounds like grief wearing a voice. And some Todd helping me, I hear my name woven gently into it, not calling, inviting. I don't answer anymore. I learned that some places don't want to scare you. They want to keep you. They want to turn your memories into doors and your love into keys. And they will sing forever if it means you'll just take one more step into the dark. We survived Greenbrier, but part of us is still out there, listening. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't what I saw, it was what I didn't hear. No wind in the trees, no distant highway hush, no coyotes, no running water, even though the river was supposed to be less than a mile away. Just a thick, padded silence pressing against the RV like felt wrapped around steel. My name's Caleb, I'm 37. I grew up in Missouri, learned to sleep through thunderstorms and sirens and the long, invisible noise of the Midwest. Silence never scared me until that January night near Roaring Fork when the mountains decided to hold their breath. I had driven most of the day through western Colorado, chasing that winter version of solitude people romanticize, snow-dusted empty pullouts, the kind of cold that makes you feel like you're the only warm thing left in the world. Roaring Fork had been on my list for years, a place people described with respect more than beauty. The kind of respect you give something that doesn't care whether you survive it or not. The campground was officially closed for the season. That should have been my first sign to turn around. But there was a smaller, unmarked, dispersed camping area just off an old service road, cleared enough for 3 or 4 rigs if you didn't mind the trees closing in close on all sides. I told myself I'd only stay one night, just long enough to wake up with frost on the windshield and feel like I'd earned something. By the time I parked, the sun was already bleeding out behind the ridgeline, purple light on white snow. The cold came fast once the shadows settled, dry, sharp, the kind that doesn't creep so much as strike. I chalked the wheels, shut down the engine, and stepped outside to check the area. That's when I noticed the smell. Not pine, not damp earth, not wood smoke, something bitter, metallic, like overheated brakes or singed wire. It drifted through the trees in slow, uneven waves, faint enough to doubt, but persistent enough that I kept catching it no matter which way I turned. I told myself it must be coming from my own engine, that maybe I'd worked it a little too hard on the uphill grade. Denial is efficient that way. It doesn't require evidence. I finished my checks fast and retreated inside. Locked the door. Pulled the insulated window covers down. Kicked the heater on low. The RV filled with that familiar hum, the soft click of propane ignition, the gentle vibration through the floor. For a while, that sound anchored me to normalcy. Dinner was something forgettable from a can. I ate it standing up, spoon scraping metal in the quiet. The smell from outside still crept in through the vents now and then, threading itself into the air like a question I didn't want to answer. I opened the roof vent for a moment to clear it out and immediately shut it again when the cold poured in like water. Around 8, the silence outside thinned just enough for the forest to start speaking again. A distant branch crack, snow sliding off a bough, wind finally moving in the higher canopy while the ground remained still. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, layered, mismatched, like the landscape couldn't decide which season it wanted to be. I checked my phone, no service. I hadn't expected any, but the reality of that small gray no-signal text still landed heavier than it should have. That's when I saw the lights. At first, they were just a dull glow flickering through the trees to the north. 2 of them, low to the ground, stationary. I thought maybe another camper had rolled in late, though I hadn't heard an engine. I waited for the beams to swing or bounce as a vehicle repositioned. They didn't. Minutes passed. The lights stayed exactly where they were, steady, white, unwavering. Not headlights the way you expect them to be. No spill, no sweep, just 2 fixed circles of brightness suspended between tree trunks. A low prickle crept up the back of my neck. I told myself they could be reflectors on a sign catching moonlight. Except the moon wasn't up yet. The sky outside the windows was still inked with heavy cloud. Against my better judgment, I cracked the curtain at the kitchen window and leaned in close, careful not to silhouette myself against the interior light. The glass was so cold it burned when my knuckle brushed it. Between the trees, maybe 100 yards out, sat a vehicle, parked dead still, white, boxy, taller than a pickup. The shape tugged at recognition without quite arriving. The lights were mounted high and wide apart, too high for a car. The body was plain, no markings, no decals, no visible plates from this angle, just a pale slab against the dark timber. A Ranger truck, my brain supplied automatically. That made sense. Closed season patrol. Someone checking that I wasn't where I shouldn't be, except the vehicle wasn't on the service road, it was off it. Deep enough between the trees that getting there would have required a deliberate choice, and there were no tire tracks in the snow leading to it. The ground between my RV and that spot was untouched, smooth as fabric. I waited for the driver's door to open, for footsteps, for a flashlight beam to cut the dark. Nothing happened. 10 minutes went by, then 15. The heater clicked on and off behind me. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I realized at some point that I'd been holding the curtain open the entire time, motionless, like if I didn't move, the thing out there wouldn't notice me. That was when the smell came back, stronger now, no longer faint. It poured through the RV in a sudden wave, sharp enough to make my eyes sting. Hot metal, ozone, something burnt and synthetic. The lights outside blinked once. Not off, not on. Just a brief, uneven dimming, like a slow blink from something that didn't need eyes to see. My heartbeat spiked so hard it blurred my vision at the edges. I let the curtain fall and backed away from the window, every nerve in my body ringing like a struck wire. The rational part of my brain was already working overtime, desperately stacking explanations like sandbags against a rising flood, generator surge, faulty electrical, military test vehicle, forestry service using new equipment. Each excuse felt thinner than the last. I didn't want to go back to the window, but I couldn't stand not knowing if the thing had moved. Curiosity and fear tangled together in my chest until I couldn't tell which one was pulling me forward. I edged back, lifted the curtain just enough for one eye. The vehicle was closer. Not dramatically, not charging, but closer in the way that's worse, subtle enough that part of you wants to believe you misjudged the distance before. The lights now burned through a different set of branches. The snow beneath them glowed faintly. Still no tracks. Still no sound. That's when I noticed something else. There was no visible exhaust. In this cold, any running engine should have been breathing clouds into the night. My own RV was venting steady white plumes that drifted and vanished among the trees. The thing facing me exhaled nothing. The lights shone. That was all. I backed away again, pulse hammering. I locked the deadbolt even though the door was already closed. The click sounded fragile. I moved through the RV, turning off lights one by one until only the faint blue glow of the control panel remained. I wanted the dark on my side. Minutes stretched, then more, and then came the knock. Not loud, just a soft, measured tap against the side of the RV. Once, pause, once again. It didn't come from the door. It came from the wall near the rear bed. Every logical answer evaporated at that point. Whatever was out there was close enough now to touch my rig. Close enough that I could smell it. Burnt metal and cold air and something underneath that made my stomach roll. The knock came again. This time, harder, deliberate. My mouth went dry. My hands shook so badly I had to clench them into fists to keep from making noise. I stood frozen in the narrow aisle, aware of every thin barrier between me and the dark outside. Aluminum, insulation, paneling, nothing that would stop anything determined enough. A shadow slid across the frosted window over the bed. Not a hand, not a face. Just a tall, narrow shape that lingered for a second too long before drifting out of view. The inner conflict that tore through me then wasn't just fear for myself. It was the sick, twisting realization that if this was a ranger, if this was someone official, then I was misreading everything. And if it wasn't, then no one was coming to help. Trust and suspicion warred inside me so violently, I couldn't tell which one hurt more. The knock traveled. It tapped once near the back, then once near the middle, then finally at the door, slow, patient, waiting. I stood there in the dark with my heart punching against my ribs, the smell thick in my lungs, the heater cycling on and off like a nervous breath, knowing with cold clarity that whatever had followed me into that silent stretch of forest did not behave like anything I had ever known. And that the worst part wasn't that it was outside. It was that it knew exactly where I was inside. My legs finally obeyed when the knock came a second time at the door. I drifted backward instead of stepping, heel brushing the edge of the dinette, lungs barely pulling in air. The sound wasn't aggressive. That was the part that hollowed me out. It wasn't force. It was expectation. Like whatever stood on the other side already knew I would open it eventually. Another knock, then a voice, muted by the door, flattened by insulation, low and steady. Camp check. 2 words. Nothing more. It took everything in me not to answer automatically. That reflex to comply with authority with assumed safety rose fast and hard. My hand even lifted a few inches before my mind caught up with my body. The smell surged again at the door seam, stronger than before, making my eyes water. Camp check, the voice repeated. It sounded wrong in a way that's almost impossible to explain. The rhythm was off, like the words had been learned, memorized, and replayed without understanding. No natural rise or fall, no breath between syllables, just sound pushed through a shape that had figured out how to make it. I swallowed and forced my voice to work. "Ranger truck should be on the road," I said, surprised by how small and far away I sounded. "You're off the access line." Silence. Then the faintest sound of movement, not footsteps, more like fabric dragging across bark. "Step outside," the voice said. Not a request. Something inside me broke at that point, not loudly, but clean and final. The part of me that still wanted to believe this was a misunderstanding, a routine check, an overreaction. It snapped. I suddenly knew, with a certainty that felt older than thought, that if I opened that door, there would be no version of this night where I walked back inside on my own terms. I backed toward the cab section where the driver's door was, the metal floor cold through my socks. The knock followed me along the RV's length from the outside, syncing with my movement, tap, tap, until it reached the front. The voice shifted position with it. "Step outside." The driver's door was locked. I unlocked it with shaking fingers, the click loud in the enclosed space. Snow slid into the entry well as I cracked it open a few inches, blinding white against the dark. The vehicle with the lights was gone. Not backed up, not turned away. Gone. The snow where it had stood was smooth and untouched, as if it had never been there at all. The trees held only shadow now, silent witnesses to a thing that no longer existed. For one brief, dangerous second, relief surged through me. Then I heard movement behind the RV. Not a step, a repositioning, something shifting its weight in the snow without compressing it. The knock came again, this time right beside my head, on the metal panel inches from the open front door. "Last chance," the voice said softly. The smell was overwhelming now, hot metal, burnt plastic, and underneath it something like old oil left too long in open air. I threw the driver's door open and jumped. The cold hit me like impact. My feet punched through crusted snow into softer powder beneath, the shock of it shooting up my legs. I sprinted without direction, just away, arms pumping, breath tearing out of me in ragged clouds. Behind me something moved, not fast, not slow, steady. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The shape that detached from the darkness near the rear of my RV was tall in a way that didn't match human proportions. Long through the spine, narrow through the shoulders. It moved forward without lifting its feet fully, like it was gliding just above the surface instead of walking on it. There was no face that I could clearly see, just a pale suggestion of one, washed out by reflected snowlight. The eyes, if they were eyes, didn't mirror light the way they should have. It didn't chase me. It followed. That distinction matters more than you think. I crashed blindly through low branches and snow-laden scrub, lungs burning, vision tunneling. The forest warped around me, trees stretching too tall, gaps closing too fast. Every few seconds, that smell surged again, letting me know the distance between us hadn't changed. I ran until my legs gave out and dropped me into a drift that swallowed me almost to the waist. Panic exploded white hot in my chest as I thrashed, snow filling my boots and sleeves. I expected cold hands, pressure, weight. Instead, the smell faded. The sense of presence withdrew like a tide pulling back from shore. I lay there gasping, face stinging from wind and tears, listening for anything that would tell me it hadn't simply waited for me to exhaust myself. The forest stayed quiet, too quiet again. That same padded silence descended, heavier now because I knew what it could hide. When I finally staggered back to my feet, I had no sense of direction. The RV lights were gone, killed when I'd turned everything off. The trees closed in on all sides, identical pillars in the dark. I chose a direction at random and trudged forward, every step a gamble. It took maybe 10 minutes, or maybe 40, for me to find the service road. I recognized it not by sight, but by the sudden change in texture under my feet. Packed, gritty, unbroken by drifts. I followed it downhill until my knees started to shake from fatigue. That's when I saw headlights, real ones. They came from around a bend, bouncing with the uneven road, engine noise finally tearing a hole through the silence. A county sheriff SUV rolled into view and slowed when it saw me stumbling toward it out of the dark like some half-frozen ghost. The deputy who stepped out was a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a jaw set hard by years of winter nights like this. She took one look at me, snow-caked, shaking, pupils blown wide, and wrapped me in a blanket from the back seat without asking a single question. Only after I was inside the warm cab, fingers slowly thawing into pain, did she speak. "You see it too?" she asked quietly. That question hollowed me in a way fear never could. I stared at her. "The Ranger truck," I said. "White, no markings, off the road." She nodded once, not surprised, not skeptical, just resigned. "You're the fourth this season." The story came out of me in broken bursts as we drove. Lights, knocking, the voice, the smell, the way it moved. She listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on the road as if she didn't want to give the dark beside us any more attention than necessary. When I finished, she exhaled slowly through her nose. Forestry has no patrols running in that sector this time of year. State doesn't either. Whatever people are seeing out there, it's not on any log. "Then what is it?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. The SUV's headlights swept across snowbanks and deadfall, carving the world into brief white slices. "All I know," she said finally, "is it doesn't approach people who stay on the road. It goes to the ones who cut off alone where no one's supposed to be." They dropped me at a year-round ranger station nearly an hour later. By the time I looked back up the service road, the forest had already swallowed every trace of where I'd been. My RV was recovered 2 days later. They found it exactly where I'd left it. No damage, no tracks, no sign that anything or anyone had ever been near it at all. I don't camp alone anymore. That's not the lesson people expect me to end with, but it's the honest one. The mountains taught me that solitude is a privilege, not a right. That some silences aren't empty, they're waiting, and that when the night speaks to you in a voice that feels almost human, the most dangerous thing you can do is answer out of politeness. I still dream about that smell sometimes, burnt metal and cold plastic. It slides into my sleep without warning, and I wake up knowing, absolutely knowing, that whatever followed me through those trees did not need the road. It only needed permission. The first thing I noticed was the silence, so complete it felt like the mountains were holding their breath. Snow has a way of swallowing sound, but that night at Newfound Gap, it wasn't just quiet, it was watchful. My name is Elliot Rourke. I was 34 years old in February of 2022, driving alone through the Smokies in my old Volkswagen camper, trying to outrun a year that had hollowed me out. The kind of year where you don't lose one big thing, you lose 100 small ones until you're not sure what's gone anymore. Sleep, certainty, trust in your own instincts. I told myself this trip was about getting quiet again, about winter solitude, about clearing noise. But the mountains don't clear you. They test what's left. I reached Newfound Gap just after dusk. The wind was already sharpening, slicing down through the pass, like pushing loose snow across the asphalt like pale smoke. The temperature had dropped fast, faster than forecast. My dashboard read 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The ranger station was closed, no other campers, no footprints anywhere near the pull-off where I parked. Just me, my van, and 5 miles of frozen darkness in every direction. I remember thinking it was perfect. That kind of stupid thought only feels stupid in hindsight. Inside the van, the cold crept in through seams I'd patched a dozen times and never quite sealed. I lit the propane heater and rubbed my hands together, listening to the metal tick and contract. Outside, the tree lines swayed like a dark tide. Every now and then, heavy snow dumped from a branch with a hollow thud, like something landing just out of sight. I cooked soup, wrote in my notebook, told myself I wasn't lonely. I was choosing to be alone. That was the lie I brought with me. Sometime after midnight, the wind died. Not gradually, all at once. That's what woke me. It felt like waking underwater. No breeze, no branches, no distant highway hiss, just dead air. I lay there staring at the roof of the van, breath fogging above me, listening for anything. My heartbeat was suddenly too loud. I remember thinking how strange it was that even the forest insects were silent. No winter birds, no far-off howl. Then I heard it. The sound wasn't loud, it was careful. A single crunch, snow compressing under weight. Too close. Not the chaotic slide of falling snow, not shifting branches. This was deliberate pressure, heel to ground, someone taking a step. I held my breath without meaning to. Another step followed, slow, measured, close enough that I could feel the vibration through the floor. The van's windows were fogged, ice feathering the edges. I couldn't see anything but blurred shadows beyond the glass. My brain reached instantly for excuses. Late hiker, ranger doing rounds, lost tourist. The stories we tell ourselves don't start as lies, they start as shields. Then the footsteps stopped, right beside my van. So close I could hear the faint squeak of packed snow shifting under someone's weight. I waited for a knock. It didn't come. Minutes passed. Maybe seconds. Time stretches strangely when fear is quiet. Finally, I forced myself to move. My muscles protested, stiff with cold and hesitation. I reached forward, wiped a circle clear in the fogged window with my sleeve. Nothing. Just snow, white and unbroken except for one set of boot prints leading straight up to my driver's side door. And that's when my stomach dropped. There was no second set, no return path, no scattered steps, just a clean, solitary trail of prints that ended right at my van, like the person had simply vanished into the air. The rational part of my mind tried to work the math. Wind could have filled them in. Snowdrift patterns can play tricks. Maybe the angle hid the rest. I pressed my face closer to the glass, breath ghosting over the frost. The prints were sharp, edged, fresh. I didn't sleep after that. I sat upright with my hands wrapped around a cooling mug, watching the white blur beyond the glass slowly brighten as dawn fought its way through the cloud cover. The footprints didn't change. Didn't soften. Didn't fade. They stayed exactly as they were, frozen in arrival. At first light, I stepped outside. The cold punched me immediately. My boots sank deep as I followed the prints with my eyes. They led from the tree line straight to my door and nowhere else. No overlap, no stagger, no sign of a turn. I even walked a wide circle around the van, searching for any hint of departure. There was nothing. The mountain had accepted something and refused to give it back. I told myself it was time to leave. That was the smart answer. But fear doesn't always push you forward. Sometimes it roots you in place, daring you to look longer, daring you to find proof that what you felt was real. I packed slowly, let the engine warm, pushed unease down under routine. As I pulled back onto the road, I caught something in my rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought it was a trick of light, a dark smudge between the snowbanks. Then it moved, not crossing the road, not retreating. It just tilted slightly, like a head cocked in curiosity. I blinked, and it was gone. The drive down the mountain took longer than it should have. Patches of ice forced me to crawl. Fog thickened in the low spots like breath trapped between the trees. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel the entire way, jaw locked, mind spinning through explanations I didn't believe. By the time I reached the visitor center area, daylight felt unreal, thin and washed out. A pair of parked SUVs broke the illusion of solitude. People existed again. Noise returned. The world stitched itself back into something recognizable. And yet the feeling didn't lift. It clung to me like wood smoke in my clothes. I spent the next 2 nights at a lower elevation campground outside Gatlinburg. Crowded, loud, touristy, fire pits, laughter, generators humming all night. It should have grounded me. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the tracks. Alone. Ending at my door. On the 3rd night, a storm rolled in fast. Wet snow this time, heavy and blinding. Camp hosts warned everyone to avoid the higher roads. Newfound Gap was officially closed again by nightfall. That should have been the end of it. But logic doesn't dissolve unease. It only teaches it patience. Sometime near 2 a.m., long after the campground had gone quiet, I heard the sound again. Crunch. Not beside my van. Further away. Then another. Then several in sequence. Running, fast, too fast for the snow. They passed through the trees behind my campsite, circling wide. I never saw anything, just the sound carving through the storm. Branches shook, snow hissed down in wet sheets. Something moved with purpose out there. Not wandering, not lost. Hunting. I stayed frozen inside the van, lights off, breath shallow, heart battering my ribs. The smell of damp pine seeped in through the vents, sharp and metallic. The footsteps never came close enough this time to touch the van. But they didn't leave either. They circled for over an hour. When the storm swallowed them again, I realized my hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip my phone. No signal, no service. Just the digital clock glowing faintly on the dash, 3:17 a.m. That was the first night I confronted the thought I'd been avoiding since Newfound Gap. That whatever had walked up to my door in the snow hadn't been curious. It had been checking if I was still there. And the worst part wasn't the fear. It was the realization that some part of me already knew this wasn't over. The next morning, I left without telling anyone. No goodbye to the camp host. No explanation to the couple across from me who had spent the night drinking and shouting like nothing in the world could reach them. I packed in silence, moved like I was being timed. The storm had passed, leaving the ground soaked and heavy, slush pressed into every rut of gravel. My tires fought their way free with a wet groan. As I pulled out, I didn't look back. I told myself I was heading west, away from the Smokies, away from whatever pattern my fear was trying to draw. But somewhere outside Sevierville, with the sky a flat sheet of dull gray and my knuckles aching from how tight I'd been gripping the wheel, I realized the truth. I wasn't driving away. I was circling. Fear doesn't always flee. Sometimes it retraces its steps, desperate to change the ending. By late afternoon, snow started again, lighter than before, but relentless. The kind that doesn't threaten you outright, just wears you down grain by grain. I stopped at a roadside diner outside Cherokee for coffee, warmth clawing back into my fingers as a waitress with tired eyes poured without asking. "You headed up the mountain?" she asked. "Not tonight," I said too quickly. She gave a small nod, like she'd already known the answer. "Road closes early. Weather's not done with it yet." I stared into my cup. The coffee smelled burnt and bitter and grounding. "Anyone been hiking up there last night? After closure?" Her brow furrowed. "Not that I heard. Why?" I shook my head. "Thought I saw someone." She watched me a second longer than was comfortable. "People see things in storms," she said finally. "Doesn't mean they're there." That line followed me all the way back to the van. By nightfall, I had done a full circle without meaning to. Back on the northern edge of the park, parked in a primitive pull-off I didn't remember choosing. Trees crowded close on both sides. No service, no other vehicles. The map app refused to load. Isolation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just settles in quietly and waits for you to notice. I sat there with the engine idling, breath fluttering in short, anxious bursts, telling myself to leave again, telling myself I was being stupid, that I was letting one strange night spiral into a story bigger than it deserved. And then the smell hit me. Cold iron, rotting leaves, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like spoiled fruit. It slipped into the van through the vents before I could shut them, thick and wrong. My stomach tightened immediately. The forest has 100 smells in winter: wet bark, frozen soil, distant smoke. This wasn't one of them. This was layered, intentional. Like something had passed through recently and left itself behind. I killed the engine. Silence dropped hard. The snow began tapping lightly against the roof again. I sat there, listening to my own breath, the faint ticking of cooling metal, the distant creak of trees shifting under their burdens. That's when I heard the footsteps return. Not circling this time. Approaching. Slow. Even. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Each step landed with the same measured pressure, neither rushed nor hesitant. Not the gait of an animal, not the uneven stumble of a lost hiker. This was controlled. Expectant. They stopped just outside the rear of the van, close enough that I could hear the soft whisper of breath through fabric, close enough that warmth ghosted the fog on my back window. I didn't turn. Every instinct screamed to look, to confirm, to anchor fear to a shape. Another, quieter instinct, the older one, told me not to give it my eyes. The rear door handle rattled once, just enough to test it. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle trembling with restraint. I could feel sweat collecting at my hairline despite the cold. The smell outside intensified, pressing in through every seam. Another rattle. Longer this time. Not violent. Patient. Then, nothing. Seconds dragged. My pulse thundered in my ears. I counted breaths like it might tether me to something solid. Finally, the pressure at the door released. Footsteps retreated. But they didn't leave. They moved to the side of the van, to my window. The glass darkened with a shadow inches from my face. The fog on the inside bloomed outward, reacting to warmth on the other side. A vague outline pressed against it, too tall to be a child, too slim to be layered with winter gear. And then, very slowly, a handprint formed. Not a smear. A perfect print. 5 long impressions blooming through the frost, each finger distinct, as if the glass itself were breathing it into being. The fingers lingered, then slid downward. When the shadow receded, I puked into the trash bag beside my seat without making a sound. I don't know how long I stayed like that afterward, curled forward, shaking, staring at that fading handprint as the warmth bled out of it and the frost reclaimed the surface. When I finally lifted my head again, the snow had thickened outside, swallowing tracks almost as soon as they formed. Almost. I forced myself to look. Fresh boot prints cut a slow arc around the van. But again, no approach path, just emergence, as if the ground itself had decided to stand up and walk. That's when panic finally broke through, denial completely. I slammed the ignition. Nothing. The engine turned once, weak and hollow. Again, just a click. The battery lamp flickered. Dead. Of course it was. I yelled then, not words, just sound ripped out of my chest, at the dark, the trees, the snow, the impossible geometry of those prints. The sound of my own voice coming back at me from the forest felt wrong, distorted, like something else was learning how to use it. The response came from the trees. Not a yell, not a howl, a version of my scream. Pitched wrong, drawn out, mocked. It slid through the branches like wet fabric being pulled tight. That was the moment I understood I was no longer dealing with a presence that wanted entry. It already believed it had it. I grabbed my flashlight, my knife, laughable, and shoved the rear doors open. Snow flooded in instantly, blinding white and stinging cold. I jumped out into knee-deep drifts, breath shredding in my lungs as I ran without direction, just away from the van and whatever was claiming it. Branches tore at my jacket, roots caught my boots. The forest closed ranks like I had offended it by moving at all. Behind me, I heard the footsteps resume. Faster now. Matching me. Not chasing. Pacing. Letting me know it didn't need to hurry. My lungs burned. Terror tunneled my vision. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly, catching glimpses of trunks that looked like hunched figures, shadows that moved a beat too late. And then, footing vanished. The ground gave way beneath me without warning, and I dropped hard, the impact rattling through my spine and slamming the air from my chest. Snow filled my mouth. Cold metal bit into my ribs. I had fallen into a narrow ravine, half hidden by drift, a break in the earth that swallowed sound and light alike. The flashlight skidded from my grip and vanished into the dark below. Pain flared across my side with every breath. Above me, at the lip of the ravine, the footsteps stopped. Snow trickled down in soft curtains. Something shifted its weight at the edge. I lay there in the dark, lungs heaving, vision swimming, listening to the sound of that presence, thinking. And then it began to descend. Snow loosened above me in small avalanches as whatever stood at the rim shifted its weight. I pressed my back against the frozen earth, trying to make myself smaller than my bones would allow. Each breath felt like glass in my chest. My right side burned where I'd struck the metal edge hidden beneath the drift, old guardrail maybe, or debris from a forgotten road cut. Blood warmed, then cooled against my skin. For a long time, it didn't move. It listened. I could feel that in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The silence itself felt attentive, curious, like the dark was leaning in. Then came the first step downward. Snow crushed softly, cautiously. Not a slip, not a slide, a deliberate placement of weight. Something was climbing into the ravine with me. The walls narrowed as it descended. The cold grew sharper, denser. My breath fogged quickly in front of my face, and I hated that it made me visible. I clawed my way backward, boots slipping against packed ice and stone, trying to wedge myself deeper into shadow. Another step. Closer now. The smell reached me again, iron and sweetness and rot. Stronger in the confined space, it coated the inside of my mouth. I gagged and pressed my sleeve against my face, trying to filter it out, but it came through anyway, invasive and intimate. My mind broke into fragments. This can't be real. This is shock. Animals don't move like this. People don't either. A shape eased into view above me, blocking out the little starlight that filtered down. Tall. Narrow. The outline wrong in ways I couldn't quite measure. It moved with a carefulness that suggested intelligence, but not familiarity with a body like mine. Not yet. I raised the knife in my shaking hand, useless, but all I had. The metal reflected a sliver of pale light, just enough to paint the edge of what was descending. It was wearing boots. That detail hit me harder than anything else. Heavy, treaded winter boots. Scuffed, iced along the seams. The kind you buy at an outfitter. The kind people trust their lives to. The kind that leave clean prints in fresh snow. Above the boots were legs wrapped in something dark and soaked through, fabric clinging wrong to angles that bent too far inward. My gaze tried to climb higher, and my vision rebelled, sliding away like it refused to complete the image. "Stay back," I croaked. The sound came out thin, frail, almost polite, the head tilted, that same curious angle I'd seen in the mirror days ago. Then it spoke. It used my voice, not perfectly. It came out stretched and layered, as if multiple takes were overlapping, each one slightly out of sync. "Stay back," it said. My blood went cold in a way the winter hadn't managed yet. It took another step. I slashed upward blindly, blades skimming empty air. The ravine tightened, the wall dug into my shoulder blades. There was nowhere left to retreat. The thing's hand reached out of the dark. It was too long. The fingers bent at wrong points, more joints than bone should allow, like something had tried to sculpt a human hand from memory instead of reference. The skin reflected no light, just swallowed it. It touched my knee. The cold that spread from that point wasn't like freezing. It was absence. The sudden, total evacuation of sensation. My leg went numb instantly, collapsing beneath me. I screamed again. This time, it let me keep the sound. It studied my reaction like data. Then its hand slid up to my chest. Not gripping, resting. I could feel its palm through layers of clothing, radiating a dead heat like something that had once been warm and was imitating the idea. My heart hammered against that pressure wildly, desperately. I laughed then. I don't know why. Hysteria, maybe, or sheer disbelief at the shape existence had taken in that moment. Snow falling softly above us, a mountain sleeping, and me pinned in a forgotten cut in the earth by something wearing the echo of a person. It leaned closer and closer. Its face came into view. There were features. Too many, too few. The symmetry was off by degrees that made my head ache to look at it. The eyes sat too forward. The mouth too wide but never fully closed. teeth crowding each other like they'd multiplied without permission, and behind those eyes there was no hunger, no anger, just wanting, not for food, for presence, for replacement. My hands were shaking so hard the knife rattled against a rock. It tracked the movement with surgical focus. Then, slowly, it mimicked me. A second knife appeared in its other hand. Mine, the one I dropped when I fell. It turned the blade over with awkward curiosity, testing the idea of edges. Then it looked back at me, eyes unblinking. "Your turn is heavy," it said in my voice. I don't know what that meant. I only know that something in me understood it anyway. That the reason it had been checking my van, circling my campsites, pacing my movements, wasn't curiosity. It was rehearsal. When it lunged, everything collapsed into motion. I stabbed upward as it struck downward. Metal rang against metal. Sparks flashed in the dark. Its weight crushed into me, driving breath from my lungs, pinning my useless leg completely. The second blade sliced across my forearm in a line of white-hot pain. I screamed again, real this time. The ravine filled with sound, my voice, its echo, the scrape of bodies on stone, the hiss of disturbed snow. I felt its grip tighten on my chest, immense strength coiling through that alien anatomy. And then the mountain answered. The ground shuddered violently. A low, thunderous crack split through the stone around us. Above, the weight of fresh snow broke free from unstable ledges and poured down into the ravine in a roaring white collapse. The world turned to impact and cold. Snow buried us both, crushing, suffocating. I lost all sense of direction. Up, down where my own limbs ended and the earth began. Pressure mounted on my chest until stars burst behind my eyes. The last thing I felt before everything went dark was the thing's hands still on me. Still holding, still not letting go. I came back to sound first, a distant ringing, deep and constant, like wind rushing through a tunnel of bone. My lungs burned with each shallow breath I managed to pull. Something heavy pinned my lower body. Snow filled every seam of my clothing. I was alive. That fact alone felt like a mistake. It took everything I had to move my arm. The knife was gone. My fingers closed on nothing but packed ice and grit. I dug wildly, clawing at the weight on my chest, lungs screaming as I wasted what little air I had. The ringing softened into wind. Real wind. Somehow the collapse had shifted the snow away from my face, leaving a narrow pocket of brutal, precious space. I sucked in breath in ragged, sobbing pulls and kept digging. Minutes blurred, maybe longer. Finally, with a final surge of panicked strength, I tore my upper body free and collapsed onto my side, coughing up freezing crystals and blood. The ravine was unrecognizable. Walls reshaped, slopes softened, everything buried under smooth, deceptive white. I lay there shaking, half-conscious, afraid to move, afraid to look. But I forced myself. The place where it had been was empty. No shape beneath the snow, no outline, no warmth, just a broad, shallow depression where two bodies had struggled, and beside it, a single set of boot prints leading away. I watched those boot prints for a long time before I trusted that they were moving away from me. They cut a steady line up the far slope of the ravine, each impression clean despite the fresh collapse, as if the snow itself had parted to let it pass. No stumble, no hurry. Just departure, calm and certain, leaving me behind. My body was a wreck of shaking nerves and half-frozen muscle. Every movement sent pain through my ribs where the guardrail had bitten me. My forearm burned where the blade had cut, the blood already darkening and stiffening in the cold. One leg still felt wrong, heavy, distant, like it belonged to someone else. But fear will lend you strength when survival is the only argument left. I climbed. Each pull upward felt like dragging myself out of wet concrete. Snow gave way beneath my boots, sending me sliding back more than once. My lungs screamed in protest with every effort. The cold tore at my throat like wire. More than once, I thought I saw movement above me, shadows sliding between trunks. But when I forced my vision to focus, there was only wind-stirred powder lifting and settling again. When I finally hauled myself over the lip of the ravine, the forest looked exactly the same as it had before everything went wrong. That may have been the most terrifying part. No scars on the land, no evidence of violence, no proof that the mountain had just tried to erase me. only the storm-softened glow of moonlight on untouched snow, and my van, half buried, silent, crooked among the trees. I limped toward it in a stagger, each step an argument with my own body. The passenger door was crushed inward, warped like something had leaned against it with enormous, quiet pressure. The rear door hung open, bent on its hinge like a broken wing. Inside, everything was overturned. Blankets ripped, cabinets torn loose, my supplies scattered and buried in drifting white. It had searched, not for food, for familiarity. My keys were still in my pocket. My hands shook so badly that it took 3 tries to fit the key into the ignition. The dashboard lights flickered weakly when I turned it. Once. Twice. On the 3rd turn, the engine caught. The sound of it roaring to life shattered something tight and locked in my chest, and I sobbed without dignity or sound as I slammed the van into gear and tore down the forest road, branches scraping along the sides like grasping hands. I didn't stop for miles. Not until pavement appeared beneath the tires and the tree line finally loosened its grip. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I remember fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes, hands lifting me, voices that sounded too far away, the warmth of blankets that made me shiver harder instead of less, a nurse asking if anyone had been with me. No, I said. That word felt heavier than it should have. They stitched my arm, x-rayed my ribs, told me I was lucky the collapse hadn't crushed my lungs, told me the numbness in my leg might last weeks, maybe longer. They asked what happened. I told them I fell. It was the truth they could survive hearing. I stayed in town 3 days after that, long enough for the snow to melt from lower roads, long enough for feeling to crawl back into my leg as burning needles, long enough for my dreams to turn against me. Every time I slept, I was back in the van, back in the ravine, back with that presence leaning closer and closer, studying me like a problem it intended to solve with my own shape. On the 4th morning, I drove away from the Smokies for good. I sold the Volkswagen 2 months later, couldn't bring myself to sleep in it again. Couldn't even stand the smell of coolant and old fabric without my pulse starting to climb. I moved to a small town near the coast where the ground stays soft and the trees don't press in so tightly. People tell me I seem calmer now, quieter. They mistake silence for peace. The truth is, I still listen for footsteps in snow even when there is no snow. I learned something in that ravine that no amount of daylight has managed to unteach me. The wilderness doesn't just reflect what you bring into it. Sometimes it responds. Sometimes when you arrive hollowed out, running from grief, from loss, from the parts of yourself you don't want to look at, the mountains hear the shape of that emptiness and answer it with something that fits. Not a monster, not an animal, a question. What would you leave behind if something wanted to wear your life? I think about that a lot, about the way it used my voice, about the way it tested my movements, about the patience in its approach, the certainty in its departure, about those first boot prints at Newfound Gap, clean and solitary, leading straight up to my door with no return path, not arriving, selecting. I still camp sometimes, but I don't chase solitude anymore. I stay where voices overlap at night, where fires burn until dawn, where footsteps belong to people who answer when you call their name. I don't pretend that being alone is the same thing as being safe, and when winter falls and the first fresh snow arrives, bright and unmarked and beautiful, I don't step into it right away. Because I know now that snow doesn't just show you what's been there. Sometimes it shows you what has learned how to walk, and sometimes it shows you that it's still looking for the rest of you. The first sound I mistook for a bird, and that mistake nearly cost me my life. My name is Everett Caldwell. I was 38 that fall, freshly divorced, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, and desperate for silence that didn't come from a locked room. I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, close enough to the Smokies that the mountains always felt like unfinished sentences in my chest. October of 2020 had turned everything brittle. People, streets, conversations, everything felt sharp. So I took my old Volkswagen camper, the one my father rebuilt in the 90s, and drove it back into the forest like I was returning something I'd borrowed too long. Elkmont Ghost Town wasn't on my original plan. I meant to camp deeper in the park, somewhere ordinary, somewhere with families and normal noise. But the road narrowed, cell service thinned into nothing. Fog dragged itself low between the trees like it was trying not to be seen. I told myself I could handle one night in a place I'd only heard rumors about. Rusted cabins, old flood victims, abandoned dreams still stacked like firewood. I told myself rumors existed because people needed stories to explain boredom. Denial always sounds like confidence when you're inside it. By the time I reached the gravel pull-off near the burned cabin ruins, it was already past sunset. The air smelled wrong. Not smoke, old smoke. The kind that seeps out of walls years after the fire is gone, mixed with wet leaves and something sour underneath it all. I shut the engine down and sat there with my hands on the steering wheel longer than necessary, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the way the forest inhaled around me. No wind, no insects, no distant traffic. It wasn't quiet, it was waiting. I parked beside the skeletal remains of a cabin that had collapsed inward on itself decades earlier. The timbers were blackened into warped ribs. Ash still crusted the stones like frozen shadows. I told myself it was just another ruin. Appalachia is full of them. I told myself I'd sleep, wake up, hike out, breathe real air again. I kept telling myself things until they stacked into a wall between me and the truth I didn't want to feel. When I stepped out of the van, the temperature dropped like the forest had opened a hidden door. Cold crept up through the soles of my boots and settled in my knees. I could smell iron, faint but sharp under the rotten sweetness of decay. My breath looked thicker than it should have for early October. I set up fast, too fast. I didn't explore. I didn't walk the perimeter. I just positioned the van so the single rear window didn't face the cabin ruins directly. That should have been my first honest admission of fear. Inside the Volkswagen, everything was small and familiar. The chipped enamel mug, the folded blanket that still smelled faintly of motor oil and old laundry soap, the dent in the door from a trip outside Gatlinburg years earlier. These were my anchors. I turned on the overhead light, then immediately shut it off when the windows became mirrors. I didn't want to see myself looking back afraid. I ate cold trail food, barely tasted it. The forest stayed motionless. No owls, no crickets. Even the leaves refused to whisper. The silence began to feel deliberate, like a held breath. That was when I heard the screech. High, thin, too long for an animal scream, too broken for a human voice. It dragged across the dark metal against bone. It came from the direction of the burned cabin. I froze with the food still in my mouth, jaw locked mid-chew. My mind scrambled for ordinary explanations. Fox, bobcat, some wounded thing dying slowly. I'd grown up in these mountains. I knew the catalog of wild sounds. This wasn't in it. The screech came again, closer this time, and layered inside it was something worse. A rhythmic pulse, like breath forcing itself through a ruined throat. I stayed perfectly still, listening to my own heart pound loud enough that I worried it would answer whatever was out there. Then, from just beyond the reach of the van's headlights, I heard footsteps. Not the soft scatter of deer, not the shuffling drag of a bear. These were measured, careful, each step placed with intention on gravel and leaf litter. Someone, or something pretending to be someone, was circling me. I told myself it was another camper, lost, exploring. I told myself that even as my hands shook so badly, I had trouble locking the doors. The footsteps stopped behind the van, right beneath the rear window. I waited for a knock, a voice, a flashlight beam. None came. Instead, the screech sounded again, directly above me now, close enough that I felt vibration in the metal roof. The sound scraped against my spine and slid down into my chest where it hollowed out every rational thought I had left. I whispered, "Go away," to something that was never going to listen to words. For a long time, nothing happened. Minutes stretched thin and brittle. I began to breathe again in shallow, controlled sips. My muscles screamed from staying locked so long. The forest slowly thawed. A breeze stirred. Leaves shifted. Somewhere at an impossible distance, an owl finally called out. I started to believe again. That belief shattered when something dragged itself across the ruins of the burned cabin. Wood groaned. Stone scraped. Ash puffed quietly into the air. I strained my eyes through the rear window and saw movement where there should have been nothing solid left to move. A dark shape unfolded itself out of shadow. Taller than a man, wrong in the way its limbs bent, one shoulder hitching higher with every motion. And it was facing me. I could not see a face. Only a deeper darkness where one should have been. The smell of iron thickened until it coated the back of my tongue. My fear stopped being theoretical. It became physical. It pushed against my organs. It narrowed my vision into a tunnel with that shape at the center. The thing tilted its head, slowly, as if listening. Then it screamed again. This time, the sound wasn't only outside. It was inside the van, inside my head. I clamped my hands over my ears and shouted without meaning to, a raw animal sound that tore out of me before pride or logic could stop it. The shadow moved faster than I thought possible. It crossed the distance between the ruins and my rear bumper in a heartbeat. The van rocked from the impact. Something slammed against the back doors. Once, twice, 3 times. Each blow dented inward, metal shrieking in protest. I crawled forward on my hands and knees toward the driver's seat, slipping on my own spilled water, my mind glitching between disbelief and the brutal certainty of pressure against steel. The screech transformed into something wet and furious. Not a voice, not a throat, a wound learning how to speak. I fumbled the keys, dropped them, found them again with numb fingers, and twisted the ignition. The engine coughed like it was waking from a nightmare of its own. Another hit slammed the rear of the van sideways. The world tilted. Cabinets burst open and my mug shattered across the floor. "Start," I begged. "Please, start." The engine caught. I slammed my foot down and the Volkswagen lurched forward, tires spinning uselessly in gravel for a terrifying second before grabbing. As I tore out of the pull-off, something rushed alongside the van fast enough that I caught the reflection in my side mirror. A shape that bent where it shouldn't. A shadow that didn't match the trees. And for one frozen instant, something like a hand slapped flat against the glass. I didn't stop driving for almost an hour. When I finally did, miles away under a gas station's fluorescent lights, I realized I was still screaming. Later, when my hands stopped shaking enough to hold a phone, I looked up Elkmont's burned cabins. I told myself I wanted history, research, closure. What I found was an entry I couldn't unsee. A fire in the 1920s, a family trapped inside. Witnesses who swore the screaming went on long after the structure collapsed. Locals who claimed that on certain cold nights, you can still hear something trying to escape the memory of flames. They called it the screech. I slept in motel rooms for weeks after that, lights on, television noise filling every corner of silence. I told no one the details. I learned to swallow the truth the same way I had swallowed my denial. But sometimes, in the space between waking and sleep, I still smell iron. And sometimes, when the world goes very quiet, I hear that first mistake again. The sound I told myself was just a bird. I drove until the road curved back into familiarity, but familiarity didn't recognize me anymore. The gas station clerk asked if I was okay. I told him I'd hit a deer. My voice sounded steady. My eyes didn't. I checked into a roadside motel under a fake name, backed the van into the far corner of the lot, and left the curtains open so the night couldn't surprise me from behind glass. Sleep didn't come so much as it ambushed me in short, choking bursts. Every time my eyelids fell completely, the screech followed me down. Not as sound, worse than that, as pressure, as memory being pressed into raw nerve. By morning, I'd convinced myself I'd survived a panic attack combined with an animal encounter distorted by fear. People don't accept it hunted me from a burned ruin as a true event. People accept bears, coyotes, mental breaks under stress. I accepted those better too. I should have gone home. Instead, I turned back toward the Smokies. I told myself it was to reclaim the trip, to take control of the narrative. But deep down, something darker pulled at me. Something that needed to prove last night wasn't real, because if it was, Then something impossible had studied me through a mirror and learned my fear. The forest welcomed me back with sunshine and regular sounds. Birds stitched the air with calls. Wind shook branches into applause. I parked at a campground filled with normal people. Children on bikes, propane grills, folding chairs that squeaked on gravel. Safety by proximity, safety by witnesses. That night, I laughed with strangers over cheap beer and stories that never once moved beyond the limits of what the living world could explain. For hours, I felt human again. And then the temperature dropped. Not gradually, not politely. It felt like a trapdoor. Conversation slowed. Someone joked about a cold snap. Another camper poked at the fire and said the wood smelled strange. Iron. My chest tightened. Far off, deeper in the woods than any of the trails should reach, something answered the fire with a screech so distant it barely qualified as sound. Everyone paused. A few people laughed nervously. Fox, someone said. I didn't laugh. I packed up in silence while people teased me for turning in early. I locked myself inside the van with shaking hands and killed the lights. The campground settled back into noisy normalcy. Then, one by one, the sounds began to thin. Children went quiet. Laughter drained away. Even the fire's crackle softened, as if something in the dark was absorbing sound itself. A cold slickness crawled along the outside walls of the van. Not wet exactly, but clammy in the way a breath feels when it's too close. Footsteps moved between the tents. Measured. Careful. I didn't look. I didn't breathe. I didn't even pray, because something in me was suddenly terrified that whatever was out there could hear thoughts. The footsteps stopped beside the van, not behind it this time. Beside my head. The metal skin flexed inward the way it does when a hand presses flat against it. Soft pressure, controlled, exploratory. The shape of that pressured slowly along the side panel, testing seams, rivets, windows. Tracing me. A child screamed across the campground. Not in fear, confused, startled, the sound of a dream breaking. An adult's voice followed, hushed and quick. A zipper rasped. The pressure withdrew. The footsteps retreated into the trees. Sound rushed back all at once. Fires flaring, voices overlapping, musicianship of panic disguised as reassurance. People told each other it had been nothing, an animal passing through, kids inventing monsters. I drove away before sunrise. I told myself I was done with Elkmont, that whatever had followed me there had lost interest. I drove 3 states over before I slept without the lights on. I stopped hearing the screech in waking moments. I began to think the forest had let me go. It had not. The first time I heard it again, I was nowhere near the mountains. I was in a grocery store aisle, fingers wrapped around a cold carton of milk, a sound threaded through the hum of refrigeration and distant conversations, a thin, rising pressure that bent glass inside my skull. I dropped the carton. Milk split across the floor. People stared as I backed away like it had hissed at me. No one else heard it. The second time, it came from my own bathroom sink at 3 a.m. Water running wrong, the pipes singing something that wasn't mechanical. I shut off the valve and the sound continued for 2 full breaths before it died. By the third time, I understood the rules changed once you survived it. The screech wasn't to place anymore. It was bound to me. I started researching in earnest then, not the friendly Park Service histories, not the sanitized tourist pamphlets. I dove into archived newspapers, scanned handwritten church journals, called historical societies that reluctantly admitted to keeping unfiled materials. The burned cabin had not belonged to one family. It had been used long before the fire, long before Elkmont was a town, long before it was a ghost, a seasonal holding structure. Witness accounts of locked doors, of screams that weren't for help but for release, of voices that learned each winter how to imitate what people sounded like when they lost hope. The fire had not killed what lived there. It had freed it. It took longer to learn the part that pinned my breath inside my ribs. Accounts shifted after 1927, less reports of sounds at the ruins, more reports along roads, at campsites near travelers sleeping away from cities. Always the same pattern, quiet unease, then the sound mistaken for something harmless, then disappearance, madness, or escape stained with lifelong dread. It hunted movement. It followed motion. It traveled with the leaving. My hands were shaking again by the time I shut the laptop. I tried to stop moving. For 3 months, I stayed in one apartment. I walked to work. I ordered groceries. I slept between two walls far from windows. The screech faded into memory again. Then my sister called. She and her husband had bought a small travel trailer. Their first trip was planned for the Smokies. They wanted advice, routes, campsites, family stories. I told her not to go. Not in the way siblings joke about danger. Not lightly. I told her the forest wasn't what it used to be. I told her Elkmont was wrong. I told her about the cold that hunts through metal and the sound that wears voices like skin. She went silent on the phone. Then she laughed, uneasy but amused. "Everett," she said gently, "you sound like Dad before the cancer meds were balanced." Shame burned my face. I apologized. I told her I'd been stressed. I gave her the safe campground names. I did not speak again about the burned cabin. They left the next Friday. By Saturday night, my phone rang at 2:17 a.m. There was no voice on the line at first. Only a sound. High, thin, breaking. I drove without packing, drove without thinking. By the time I reached the park, dawn was leaking pale and sickly through fog that hugged the ground like something exhausted from hunting all night. Rangers were already there, search teams, a cluster of frightened campers whispering through cupped hands. My sister's trailer was parked at the edge of a loop. The door hung open. The inside was untouched. 2 trail chairs sat by a cold fire pit. Footprints led away from the campsite toward the trees. Only one set returned. They searched for 3 days. They found my sister's wedding ring near a shallow stream. They found no blood. They never found her. The screech changed after that. It learned her voice. It learned how to beg. I stopped answering any call that came in after sunset. For weeks after my sister vanished, the park rangers treated me like a grieving relative and a mild suspect at the same time. I answered their questions softly, carefully, leaving out the things that would make their pens pause too long above their notebooks. I told them about footprints. I told them about the phone call. I did not tell them that when I listened to the voicemail recording later, beneath the rising panic in her borrowed voice, there was another sound layered underneath. Thin, stretched, learning how to be human. At night, I slept with my hands over my ears. It didn't matter. The screech didn't come through sound alone anymore. It came through vibration, through pressure, through silence that bent in on itself until my thoughts felt crowded. Sometimes it used her voice. Sometimes it twisted mine. Sometimes it didn't bother with imitation at all and let the raw, flayed sound of itself bleed through my skull. I moved again. Different cities, different jobs, apartments on upper floors with concrete between me and the ground. For a while, I thought I could outpace it the way you outpace grief, by staying just ahead of your own shadow. I was wrong. Motion had always been its doorway. The more I ran, the clearer it became. The breaking point came on a winter highway in western North Carolina. Black ice. Empty road. No radio signal. The Volkswagen slid sideways at 50 miles an hour, drifted like a dream you can't wake from, then found the guardrail with a sound like the end of a sentence. The van didn't flip. It folded. Metal screamed. Glass erased itself. The world went white and quiet and far away. When I woke up, snow was falling through the shattered windshield. The engine ticked weakly. My left leg burned and refused to move. My phone lay somewhere out of reach in the wreckage. The forest stood close on both sides of the road, dark trees packed so tight they formed a single watching mass. And from that mass, something answered the sound of my crash. The screech rose from the trees, not distant this time, not searching, certain. It wasn't hunting movement anymore. It had been following me long enough to know where I would stop. I tried to crawl. Pain tore sharp and bright up my spine. My breath fogged in frantic bursts. Snow touched my face, melting and freezing in the same instant. The screech grew closer, each repetition a little more shaped, a little more intentional. Then it spoke. Not in my sister's voice, in my own. "Everett," it called softly from the dark. "I'm hurt." The sound hollowed me out. It twisted memory into a weapon and drove it deep. Tears froze on my cheeks before they could fall. The part of me that had survived Elkmont knew the rules now. It knew that whatever war voices could not be trusted, that it learned through loss, not malice, that it didn't hate. It only needed. The trees at the edge of the road bowed inward as the shape moved between them. Snow didn't touch it. Shadow broke strangely around its outline. I saw the wrong angle of its limbs, the uneven slope of its shoulders, the darkness where a face should have been, deepening with every breath it copied from me. It stopped a few yards away, listened. Then it reached out one long, bending arm toward the wreck. "Everett," it said again, using my voice with my sister's fear tucked inside the syllables. "You can rest now." Something in me finally broke clean. Not with panic, with clarity. All this time I had been running from the forest, from motion, from the thing that wore sound like skin. But beneath that running was another truth I didn't want to face. The part of me that stayed because I owed the mountains something. Because I had taken silence from my father. Because I had borrowed escape from my sister. Because I had driven away from the burned cabin while something else stayed trapped in its echo. The screech wasn't only a hunter. It was an after-image of every leaving that had ever torn through those woods, and I had added to it. My hand brushed something in the wreckage, cold plastic. The emergency road flare from my glove compartment, cracked but intact. My fingers closed around it, numb and clumsy with pain. The thing in the trees tilted its head, learned. I struck the flare. Light exploded, red and furious against the snow. Smoke howled upward. Heat slammed into my palm. The screech recoiled, not in fear, but in confusion, like a memory being interrupted by something that didn't belong to the past. I dragged myself out of the van and into the road, 1 inch of agony at a time, holding the burning flare between us like a boundary it didn't understand yet. "You learned from fire once," I whispered through clenched teeth. "You don't get to own it." The thing's outline wavered as if it were being seen through water. The screech unraveled into fragments. My voice fell apart inside its throat. I didn't stop waving the flare until my arm failed and I collapsed into the snow. I woke in a hospital with my legs set and my ribs bandaged and the smell of antiseptic smothering the forest from my lungs. The doctor said the crash should have killed me. The state trooper said there was no sign of anyone else on the road when they arrived. No footprints, no ash, no shadow in the trees. Recovery took months. Stillness, it turned out, was not the same as safety, but it was quieter. In quiet, I could finally think without the sound threading through every thought. I stopped traveling. I stopped drifting. I took a job that didn't require motion. I built a routine so repetitive it bored the fear inside me into dormancy. The screech never came back the same way. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is so still it feels like a held breath, I sense something listening at the edge of hearing, not hunting, not following, just remembering the shape of my name. I don't camp anymore. I don't tell campfire stories. But when people ask me why I flinch at recordings of distant animal calls or why I never sleep with windows open, I tell them a simple truth. Some places don't empty when people leave them. Some sounds learn, and some escapes don't end the way you think they will. They only change who's still listening.